Secretary of the Business, Transportation, and Housing Agency, Sandra Smalley, Secretary of Health and Welfare Agency, Doug Wheeler, Secretary of the Resources Agency, Joanne Cosberg, Secretary of State and Consumer Services Agency, Julie Meyer Wright, Secretary of the Trade and Commerce Agency, Joe Sandoval, Secretary of the Youth and Adult Correction Agency, Dan Kolke, Legal Affairs Secretary and Counsel to the Governor, Colonel Jay Vargas, Secretary of the Veterans Affairs, and Nancy Gutierrez, Director of the Department of Fair Employment and Housing, and David J. Terapelli, Director of the Department of Personnel Administration. Again, thank you for coming this morning.
Governor Wilson has yet to officially announce his candidacy for the 1996 Republican presidential nomination. However, he has formed an exploratory committee to begin fundraising activities.
Next, third-party candidates and the 1996 elections. 1980 independent presidential candidate John Anderson, former Rhode Island Governor Lowell Weicker, and ABC News' Cokie Roberts joined political consultants. They examined the viability of a third political party.
Thank you all for coming. I'm Chris Arterton. I'm Dean of the Graduate School of Political Management at George Washington University, and I'd like to welcome you all to one of our Forum on Politics, which is an occasional series of discussions, panel discussions on critical issues facing American politics. Today we deal with one of those that is, I think, of fundamental importance to American democracy, specifically the choice offered to voters in election contests. As everyone knows, American politics has been dominated for much of its history by only two major political parties. And while the core of support for the two parties that we now see has in fact shifted over time, sometimes dramatically, sometimes slowly, our two parties have remained essentially the same since 1858, when the collapse of the Whigs made room for the Republican Party of Abraham Lincoln. Not all of this is happenstance. Since the two major political parties control the state legislatures, and the state legislatures enact laws under which elections are conducted, they have used that power to make it extremely difficult for third parties or independent candidates to qualify for the ballot. Thus, trying to organize a third force campaign in any state is an uphill challenge, and trying to put together the basics of a presidential campaign is a nightmare of bureaucracy, filing deadlines, signature petitions, and so forth. And we should also note that on the federal level, the same exists, that the national campaign finance laws were explicitly drafted to make it unlikely that a third force would emerge and receive public funding. Not all of this is bad. Reducing the choice confronting voters to a small number of, quote, serious candidates has a certain logic. For one thing, under this system, political disputes and issues tend to become crystallized as either-or propositions. And the winner in a bi-party election is likely to receive a majority of the votes, thereby garnering greater legitimacy for governing. But clearly, not all issues, not all opinions can find expression in the programs and speeches of these, quote, serious candidates, that is, those of only the two major political parties. And in spite of the difficulties, we have had a rich history of independent candidates and minor parties. At times, they have brought vitality into the compressed political dialogue. At times, they have brought new views into our political discussion. At times, they have served to bring into political power new groups of voters and new coalitions. In many instances, however, the efforts of these third force candidates have been self-defeating at least in the short run. As they've sought to represent disaffected coalitions of voters, they've often pulled voters out of the political party that's most closely aligned to their view. And in the process, they've awarded victory to the other candidate, the one they disagree with most. But in the longer run, the positions and issues of third-party and independent candidates have been co-opted by the major two political parties. At important points in our history, third parties and independent candidates have actually played a significant role in the elections besides just this tipping function or the function of advancing new issues, new coalitions. And I think there's good reason to believe that we're entering such a period now. Most recently, Ross Perot received 18.8% of the presidential vote in 1992, thereby making the most impressive showing since Theodore Roosevelt returned from Savari in 1912 to run on the Bull Moose Party. By no means has all the power gone out of the idea that our politics needs a third alternative to Republicans and Democrats. United We Stand remains very much of a vital force nationally and across in the land in many, many states. Ross Perot is rumored to be considering a presidential campaign. Colin Powell, from whom we have a spokesperson here, has also been talked about as a potential independent candidate. Governor Weicker, who's also here on our panel, has recently been had his name touted in journalistic commentary about the possibility of a third force opening up in 1996. At the state level, in 1990, third force candidates ran in half the states, and by 1994, only 10 states did not have significant showings by candidates either from third parties or candidates running as independents. And notably, as in the case of Lowell Weicker in Connecticut, running on the banner of a Connecticut party in 1990, third-party candidates and independent candidates have started to win elections. We turn to this issue with a panel composed of first-class minds who have given a lot of thought to the needs for and the support for a third force in American politics. I'm going to introduce the panelists from your left to right alphabetically. John Anderson served in the U.S. Congress as a Republican for 20 years before he mounted an independent candidacy for president in 1980, receiving the votes of over 5.5 million American citizens. He is now a professor of law at Nova Southeastern University in Florida, and he serves as the national chair of the advisory committee for the Center for Voting and Democracy in the United States, in which he considers such issues as how election laws affect the results, the constellation of candidacies. Thus, from personal experience and from considerable thought, he knows exactly how hard it is for a third force candidate to receive a fair hearing in American politics. Ronald Evans is the national spokesperson for the exploratory committee that is seeking to draft Colin Powell as a candidate for president of the United States in 1996. By profession, he is a businessman, president and CEO of Capital Cities Enterprises, a company that specializes in real estate and business brokerage. In addition, he served 2 years in the U.S. Department of Energy during the Reagan administration. Andrew Kohut is director of the Times Mirror Center for the People, the Press in Washington, D.C. He was president of the Gallup organization in Princeton from 1979 to 1989, and in 1989 he founded Princeton Survey Research. So he holds dual roles. He's a frequent commentator in the press on the importance of and interpretation of poll results. He's been on National Public Radio, CNN, and a host of other entities. He's also currently the president of the APOR, American Association of Public Opinion Research. Here today principally because of his expertise that he brings on the fragmentation of the American electorate in a set of surveys entitled The People, the Press, and Politics. and particularly because of his knowledge of the alienation and antagonism towards politics felt by many voters. We're happy to have him here today. Cokie Roberts is a correspondent, special correspondent for ABC News covering politics, Congress, and public policy. She is a frequent member or a regular member of the weekly roundtable discussion This Week with David Brinkley and serves frequently as an anchor on ABC's Nightline. She was a news analyst for National Public Radio. You still are, still is. My apologies to National Public Radio. She is also a columnist syndicated weekly in many major American newspapers. She brings to this panel years of experience, a journalist perspective, and detailed knowledge of the workings of American politics. Lowell Weicker is currently chairman of Dressing, Lehrman and Weicker, a healthcare firm located in Bethesda, Maryland. He recently retired from the governorship of Connecticut, which he served from 1991 to 1995. And before that, for 18 years, from 1971 to 1989, he served as a Republican in the Senate, notably serving early in his career on the Senate Watergate Committee as a lone voice of Republican vigor in that unfortunate set of events. There has been, as I mentioned, considerable speculation in news columns and other outlets in the past 6 months or so since he left office that Lowell Weicker might in fact mount a candidacy for the president in 1996 as an independent candidate. So, with that introduction, I'm going to turn over to the panelists, ask them each in sequence, in reverse order that I introduced them, to address the question of how they see the politics of the next year and a half shaping up through November 1996. What they see as the prominent role that a third force candidate, whether as an independent or as a minor party candidate, third party candidate, will play on the presidential level. And at some point in the panel discussion, we'll get down into talking about how this will work out on various state levels. Governor Weicker?
Thank you, Chris. I don't think there's, first of all, let me say two things. Number one, I think you're going to have a third party in 1996 on the ballot. A centrist third party, maybe even a fourth. It's going to happen. Point number two, can independents govern? Well, I think I can speak to that point. Yes, they can. And indeed, you have independents governing right now in the United States. It probably is the newness of the idea that has people wondering, can it happen? Well, in light of all the change that is exploding around us, believe me, this is no big deal. And I say this, I might add, not in a self-serving way, because I'm doing exactly what Chris said I was doing right now. I'm enjoying the private life and in terms of my family and business and teaching and at GW later this fall. But I say it as a matter of belief as to what is actually going to occur. Now, one point I think has to be made, which is that the irrelevancy of government, be it at the state or the federal level, is what has brought the American people to the present pass. And again, you can't go ahead and legislate a solution to that irrelevancy, but what you can do is do what we've always done in America with any monopoly or duopoly, just get competition on the field. Remember this, that the inability of government to function nowadays is due to the fact that the politics strangles the government. People have to do and say so many silly things in trying to win the office that by the time they win, they are totally incapable of any manner, shape, or form of leadership. So where you hit the problem is not to try to change the President of the United States or the Governor of Connecticut, but you try to change the cast before it gets to be Governor or President through the means of competition. Now, and then I'm finished. Is there a problem? Yeah, there's a problem. Obviously, as any entity is unable to deal in the real world and succeed, so the Republican and Democratic parties have had to artificially cement themselves into power. They can't make it on their own. They can't make it in competition. And that is why when the Republican and Democratic candidate get the nomination, $40 million is wired, not even mailed, wired into their individual accounts. What does an independent candidate get? Zip. The fact is, for this federal office, President of the United States, which I think we'll all agree is not a matter of or shouldn't be a matter of local or state election laws, but because he represents the United States of America, there are 50 different laws for ballot access. Now, those are the impediments, not impossible to overcome. Ross Perot did it, John Anderson did it, others will do it. It'll be overcome. And when it is overcome, I can guarantee you we'll get to having a level playing field for everybody. And when you have that, you have the competition, and you'll get the best ideas and you get the best people out there. But the idea that you can change the government, that's not where the focus should be. Change the political process. That'll give you the best at the end.
I forgot, sir, in introducing you to mention the most important thing, which is that you're a member of the GSPM faculty. That is, you'll be teaching at the school in the fall on this subject. Koki, how do you see it? I know as a journalist you probably would prefer to go last when you'd hear what all the cards are on the table, but nonetheless, how do you see the next year and a half?
Well, first I have to say that I'm thrilled to be on this panel. I know my role is skirt on the panel, but and it is and
knowledgeable.
Skirt. But it's appropriate that we're here in the Small Business Administration Committee because it is the only one chaired by a woman in the current Congress, so I'm glad that we had to move to this room. I really came as a student because I am fascinated to hear what these people have to say about the third party and see from them really where it's going. I must say that I have two brothers-in-law who are social scientists in academia and refer to my husband and me as mere journalists. And as mere journalists, what we do is, of course, look at the data that somebody like Andy Kohut assembles, but then we do also add to that by going out and doing lots and lots and lots of interviews with voters. And I would agree with Governor Weicker that what you find in those interviews underlines the data somewhat dramatically. The data showing at the moment, I remember in the last Goaz Lake poll, I think 25% saying that they didn't like either party. But it wasn't just that they didn't like them. There's a real anger there. It's not just apartisanship, it's anti-partisanship toward the two major political parties. And I don't know, my guess is from the conversations that I've had with people that is mainly an extension of anti-Washington or anti-government, or what the governor was saying, the irrelevancy of government, a sense that politics gets in the way of government. You hear that all the time, you know, that if they could just stop being politicians and making all those speeches and being so mean-spirited and bickering with each other is a word you hear over and over again, maybe they could get something done. So there is that whole sense there, and it gets extended to the political parties. So that's why I think partly when we look at 96, we keep thinking that something might happen. Because this group of people that is disaffected is not the normal group of disaffected people. These people are voters. And for a long time we've had disaffected non-voters. But what we're seeing now is a whole group of people who are disaffected from the political parties who vote. And of course, the main ones being the Perot voters, who have been very key voters in the last two sets of congressional elections. 2/3 of Perot voters voted Democratic for Congress in 1992, and 2/3 of them voted Republican for Congress in 1994. And so you can, that's from the exit polls. So you can see an effect that they have. Are those people satisfied now? No. At least that's not what the data is showing. So where are they going to go in 96? And I think that's part of what underlines the interest in whether there will be a third party. I think also there's a sense that maybe the candidates that the two major parties will produce by the time the conventions even come around will already be seen as flawed. Now, a lot of that's our fault, but a lot of that will be that that there's not in the current Republican field a Ronald Reagan or a Newt Gingrich, for that matter. Now that could end, but as he's moose hunting or whatever, butterfly collecting. I have trouble with the animals, the giraffes, the moose, the butterflies. It's hard, but you don't have sort of a happy warrior in the Republican field. And so I think that there is a searching around there. I think there is a question mark surrounding President Clinton, which Whitewater certainly is the biggest question mark out there, but you don't know the current foreign policy problem, how that's going to evolve, all of that. And then you have threats from the left and right, where you have the Jesse Jacksons on the one hand and Pat Buchanan's on the other, talking about if the parties don't do what we want them to do, maybe we'll do our own parties. And then, as the governor said, this whole attitude about the centrist, some centrist candidate that will appeal to independents. So all of that put together does make it look like it's very likely that in 1996 that there will be a multiple field. But I always feel that when I say something like that this is always wishful thinking on the part of journalists. We're the people who are always saying it's going to be an open convention, right? Or the election's going to go to the House of Representatives, sure. And we say it because it would be great fun. It's a wonderful story if that happens, and we would love it, and we'd have a good time, and we'd get to write wonderful things and interview fascinating people, and it would be a lot more fun than the same old, same old. So I always worry that when I predict something like that it's just wishful thinking on my part.
Thank you very much. Those people in the back may want their chairs over here, and I think there's some over here. If you want to come in, please, that's fine. Andy Kohut, how do you see the attitudes of the public these days, and whether there really is a genuine base there from which a third party or an independent candidate could garner support in order to become a serious challenge in 96?
I think there are two ways of looking at 1996. One way is to look at it in a structural way, that is to look at the nature of the electorate. And there we see very definitely the potential for a third-party candidate, because the new working class, people who are mostly in the middle of the economy, middle-income people, people working in post-industrial jobs, have no connection with either party. And in all of the polling that we do, we find them most supportive of the idea of a third party, and the levels of interest in third parties much higher than they were 10 years ago. And they're the people who continue to support Ross Perot, even though they don't have a very positive view of him, continue to support alternatives to Bob Dole and Bill Clinton when we pose those test ballot questions. This is a large element of the election that has no connection with the two parties. One that struggles with economic limitations each day. It hasn't been paid off, but has received no payoff from this economic recovery, and doesn't hear Washington talk, doesn't hear traditional political talk, the way Republicans and Democrats do. So that's the structural element of it, and you can see the manifestation of this in the questions which measure interest in third party and support for third party candidates. And then there's the specifics of 1996, and I think the specifics of 1996 make a third party candidate even more likely. Generally, elections, in my view, are about simple things, mostly about how do you feel about the person who currently has the job, or that party if that person is going out of office. Well, in this case, we're not going to have an election that's strictly about Bill Clinton. We're going to have a dual referendum, not only about Bill Clinton, but also about the 104th Congress. And so the chances of people being satisfied, having satisfactory views about both Bill Clinton and the 104th Congress, I think are pretty slim, particularly given the level of cynicism that has been growing year after year. That the election situation this year is front-loaded. We're going to know very early who the major party candidates are, maybe by April, and those two candidates are going to stand out there as representatives of the Republican and Democratic Party for some period of time before the conventions. And I think it's quite likely that reservations about both Clinton and about the 104th Congress will give the electorate, the media covering the election, pause about these candidates. And the opportunities in this period for a third-party candidate to emerge are very great. And I think that's the way I would analyze it, Chris.
I think that is a nice point of transition to Ron Evans, who is a person seriously advancing a candidacy at this point, not his own, but that of Colin Powell. He is, as I mentioned, working on the draft Colin Powell committee. So how do you see it, sir?
Well, I'd like to take a different approach at it at this time, just to bring some excerpts from the Crisis magazine in February '92 by Herb Boyd and Jerry Guess. Speaking of Dr. Du Bois and Dr. Washington, Dr. Bois quotes, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. African Americans have a duty to perform, a duty stern and delicate, a forward movement to oppose part of the work of their greatest leader. That only through control over their own economic and political life could black Americans gain any parity or equality in American society. The main weakness of the Negro position is that since emancipation he has never had an adequate economic foundation." End of quote. In 1895, Booker T. Washington sought to strike a compromise. The period of Reconstruction had ended. Federal troops had been withdrawn from the South. White supremacist groups were unchallenged. The national administration was hostile. Congress was unresponsive, and the United States Supreme Court was to rule in less than a year that separate but equal was the law of the land. Quote, "In all things that are purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers, yet as one as the hand in all things essential to mutual progress. No race can prosper till it learns that there is as much dignity in tilling the field as in writing a poem." End of quote. In 1895, blacks were by large a rural people. There were few schools for blacks. There was no court protection for basic human rights. Former slaves were powerless against the white law enforcement establishment. And blacks had meager economic resources and no real politically enforceable rights. In his book, Up From Slavery, Washington wrote, "I tried to emphasize the fact that while the Negro should not be deprived by unfair means of the franchise, political agitation alone would not save him, and that on the back of the ballot he must have property, industry, skill, economy, intelligence, and character, and that no race without these elements could permanently succeed. Like all other leaders, Washington was forced to settle for a half a loaf in many instances. In addition to being the founder of Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, Washington founded the National Negro Business League in 1900, which was financially assisted by Rockefeller, who 8 years later founded the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. It took 70 years for federal government to guarantee the rights of blacks in the South to vote in 1965. 59 years for the courts to mandate the desegregation of public education, 1954, with all deliberate speed. 69 years for the Congress to outlaw discrimination in public accommodations, and 73 years for a fair housing bill to be passed. Du Bois was right in his belief that economic rights devoid of political rights was hollow at best. He rightly believed that there existed within the black community a cadre of well-qualified leaders who could provide the leadership for the struggle. Like Frederick Douglass, he felt that there must be constant agitation if Americans were to ever receive first-class citizenship. As we come to the close of the 20th century and dawning in the preparation of the 21st century, the debate as to how we can best lift our brothers and sisters who have not been privileged to enter the mainstream of American life continues. When we wake up and find that the perfect African American is in our midst in the form of retired General Colin Luther Powell, and we elect him the 43rd President of the United States, this country will have arrived 100 years late, but arrived nonetheless. One day the majority of the Congress will be African American, and yes, the Supreme Court will have more than one, but yes, we will still have a race problem. We don't believe that political empowerment and social rights alone will bring about first-class citizenship. Prejudice and racism remain active and rampant in this country and every other society in the world, but we will show the world that we are growing beyond it. There is still no level playing field for African Americans, but given the proper equipment, we will excel as we have done in many areas. And the glass ceiling still remains, but while all this continues to happen, the military was moving ahead, and now we have many generals in all branches of the military. But still only one has risen to the heights of the highest military leader in this nation, and that person is the name of General Powell, our next president. A fiscal conservative, socially liberal person with many attributes from all sides, maybe a centrist, but truly electable whichever party he chooses or no party at all, maybe independent of all party affiliations. He exhibits leadership qualities, a family person, a believer, concerned about social issues, a man with morals and goals achieved and accomplishments to his credit that transcends race. He wants peace in the world, he wants justice for all, and he wants unity for the nation, as a family and as a neighborhood, making our schools a better place to be and assisting churches in spiritual development and following. We in the exploratory draft Colin Powell for president are making a president. Powell is the answer for 1996. Our committee regional coordinators will be in Washington next week with many of the state and assistant state coordinators to continue our strategy for the 96 election and the ensuing primaries. A major petition program has begun in New England, and we believe without his announcing, we will have the majority of the vote in both parties during the New Hampshire primary. America is ready for change, and they are ready for Powell as the next president. Thank you.
John Anderson, you've been waiting a long time here this morning, but your moment has arrived, sir.
Well, thank you very much, Chris. I suppose that I'm here largely to provide anecdotal evidence of the fact that former presidential candidates do not suffer the same fate that General MacArthur said of soldiers, old soldiers. They never die, they just fade away. Former presidential candidates don't even fade away. Here they are out talking to a standing room only audience. Now, if that be considered a trial balloon, so be it. But it seems to me that it would be fatuous indeed, after the stirring declaration that we have heard from Ron Evans about the forthcoming candidacy of General Colin Powell, to deny the fact, and we began with Governor Weicker, of course, who was equally positive in his view that we would see a third party or independent candidate in 1996. I think we ought to make a distinction, and perhaps it's already been drawn, between a third party, and I know I have some libertarian friends here who are extremely irritated. They say we've been a third party for a long time. And I ran against a libertarian candidate myself in 1980. But whether or not there will be a multi-party system in the sense that we will have a third, fourth, fifth, whatever number you choose, party in 1996 is quite a different matter than whether or not we will have an independent candidate. I think we will have an independent candidate. I doubt that we will have another fully formed party fielding not only a candidate for the presidency, but candidates for the for the Congress as well. Our system is simply not congenial, not only for the reasons that Governor Weicker gave. It is not congenial to third parties. Our electoral system
doesn't make it easy, for example, to build the infrastructure, the political base that the Republicans built before they elected the greatest American president, Abraham Lincoln, in 1860. They had first, in 1854, won a plurality in the congressional elections of 1854. And it seems to me, we don't have a Perot representative here at the table, I guess, to defend him. The great and fundamental error that Ross Perot made was after that 18.8% of the vote that he drew in 1992, that he didn't build on that and organize sufficiently by congressional districts so that in 1994 he could have submitted to the electorate a slate of Perotista candidates to run for congressional office. And I think the opportunity is largely foreclosed for 1996. But I think despite the fact that the system is not congenial because it makes it difficult to finance, I had to get 2 million signatures to get on 50 state ballots, had to fight lawsuits in 9 different states, carry one case to the U.S. Supreme Court that my constitutional law students now have to struggle through, Anderson versus Calabrese, to prove that the state of Ohio could not shut out an independent because he chose 8 months before the election to run. That was bad, they said, whereas the Republicans and Democrats could nominate their candidates months later and still automatically have access to the ballot. But despite the difficulties of financing, despite the difficulties of ballot access, I believe the American people are going to demand a third candidate or a fourth candidate or an independent candidate, call him what you will or her what you will, because our elections are really not competitive unless we broaden the range of choices that people have. And after all, the 1992 election was supposed to be all about change. Well, was it? Was it really an election about change when the vast majority of the eligible American voters didn't even opt for change? They didn't vote. They didn't participate. In 1994, when the Republicans, after 4 decades, finally won the Congress, you had, depending on whose figures you use, about 36%, roughly, 36% of the eligible electorate participating in what was supposed to be the most sweeping and startling change in American politics in 4 decades. So I think the American voters are beginning to realize that the constricted form of our political process that limits participation, really because people aren't all that interested and don't have that wide a range of choices, limits it to about 1/3 of the voters, is going to force a change in our electoral system. Now, if I had my druthers, of course, I'd like to see proportional representation. The Center for Voting Rights and Democracy has been advocating that we ought to be talking about the single transferable vote, that we ought to be talking about proportional representation, cumulative voting, other means whereby voters, instead of being classified simply on the basis of lines within which they live, could vote on the basis of what they really think and believe, which is the case in most Western European democracies. So I think the times are right. I believe the voters have awakened to the necessity of seeing not just a third force in some vague, generalized sense, but in the form, hopefully, not only of an independent candidate in 1996, but on the basis of the strength that he can and she or she can show in that election, begin to build a 6th electoral system in our country. We went through about 5, I think, with the Roosevelt coalition that was formed in 1992 or 1932, that we could see the formation of yet another electoral system that would include, yes, a third party and maybe even a fourth.
Once again, the people out there, there's still seats over here if you'd like to move in. I wanted to say, since John Anderson mentioned Ross Perot, and that we had invited Russ Verney, who's the national spokesperson for United We Stand, to come on this. He was undergoing surgery at this point. He even considered coming in from Dallas by telephone hookup, but his doctors squashed that when they put him under anesthetic. So we were not able to have someone from Ross Perot's force here with us today, which I think is an unfortunate development. I wanted to ask to focus a little bit more carefully on the angry American voter, that segment that has been hostile to politics and demanding change. It is said that they demanded change in '92 and moved to elect Bill Clinton. They demanded change in +94 and moved to elect the Republican Congress. Have they been satisfied by the events of the last 100+ days here in Washington? Is the anger toward the political system gone out of this? Or is it likely to be manifest in a strong third force? It strikes me that people who are by some nature disgruntled in the system may, as John Anderson suggested, just turn their backs on it and walk away from it. And I know there are lots of people who do that out of frustration and don't participate. But do you really see that this group of people will be a catalyst for major change in the next 4 or 5 years? Andy, I think
you have to make a distinction between how people feel about the work of the 104th Congress and how the public judges that generally, and the more systemic cynicism that's grown year after year with politics in Washington. What we have found is that the percentage of people saying in our polls that they would vote for a third-party candidate has increased as opposition or disapproval to the plans and policies of the Republican Party have increased since December. So while we had 14 or 15% saying they would vote third-party candidate in December, that's all the way up to 20% as people are both unhappy with what the Republicans are doing on the Hill and also continue to largely disapprove of Bill Clinton. In fact, if you take people who disapprove of both Bill Clinton and of the Republican policies and Republican policies, 60% say they would vote for a third-party candidate. So there's this satisfied with neither with neither force, and that's really what I was talking about when I mentioned.
How big is that group? How big is the group?
That's about 20% of the electorate at this point in time. The question is, how big will it be a year from now? And that's really hard to say. The issue of cynicism and discontent with the political system more generally, and the disconnect that people in the middle of the income range, in the middle of the electorate have with politics, is a little broader than that, and that's certainly here to stay, or at least here for a while.
Chris, could I ask a question of Andy? To what extent do you believe, and do you have figures to bear this out, when you talk about the systemic discontent or the discontent on the part of the American electorate with the system itself, do you see a great linkage between that and the failure of either one of the two major parties to do anything about reforming the campaign process, about addressing specifically campaign finance, about the fact that a candidate says, I've got to raise $50,000 a day between now and the end of 1995 if I want to run in the primaries and be elected President of the United States? Is that fueling to any great extent this suspicion and dissatisfaction of the American voter?
Well, to some extent, but I think the larger issues are economic discontent, are really at the root of this. The middle class hasn't recovered from the recession of 1992, but also the percentage of the view that politicians are not to be trusted, that the political system is in gridlock, that things don't work well here in Washington, and that the government doesn't serve people, in part has to do with the fact that the dominant age group in our population, people in their 30s to 50s, were raised at a time where all American institutions were under attack. And their views about the political system reflect that. That fueled with the economic discontent of the middle class, ongoing wrongdoing being uncovered at all levels of government, state, local, and national, creates a situation unlike 10 years ago where most people say the government doesn't work on our behalf and we can't trust politicians to do anything other than work hard to get elected.
I wonder about this question of whether we're really talking about the process versus the performance of government, the political process. And I wondered if Lowell Weicker had any comments on when he ran as a third-party candidate in 1990, whether he really felt that his candidacy drew energy from the kind of gridlock, stymie questions of government not accomplishing something versus a gap in the political spectrum, that the two major parties were really not offering a range of choice of programmatic issues that the voters responded to, and that energized his campaign.
Well, I think that what energized the campaign was you had the wealthiest state in the Union, Connecticut, that had just incurred the biggest deficit percentage-wise in terms of its budget of any state in the Union. Fact is that in 1 year's time, Connecticut had piled up $1 billion plus deficit on a $7 billion budget. This, the wealthiest state in the Union. Not necessarily, disconnected from what's going on here in the United States, wealthiest nation in the world. So I think people saw this great state going down the crapper, spelled with a K, and felt, we better do something about it, and this is the way we attack the problem. But I'd like to go ahead and make a point which I think I've wanted to make for a long time, which is the time has come to stop babying the American public. There isn't any such thing as Hartford or Washington or the government. This angry American public, they are the government. That's the uniqueness of our system in the United States of America. And if they want to get angry, may I suggest they can do so in a very positive way and get their butt down to the polls and start voting for those issues and those people that are going to make a difference in their lives. And all the anger in the world isn't going to do the job as to the governing of this country. And in the course of that, clearly, they're going to have to make the American people some declarations against self-interest. No, not everybody can have what they want. This is a give and take process. Nobody knows. I'm a pick and shovel politician and proud of it. I don't go out on the floor of the Senate or in a state where I didn't have one single representative of my party either in the House or the Senate and managed to put the state back on its feet. That's a give and take business. Well, the same holds true of the public. They got to understand that, yes, they've got to do some things for their neighbor, and certainly they can expect something in return as to whatever their opportunities or problems are. I find it incredible in this wealthiest of all nations that, for example, we like to lay all of our problems at the doorstep of the poor, using the buzzword welfare. I have to point out that's a very small percentage of our population. The fact is, it's the rest of us. That means all of us that are soaking up the resources of the United States of America. Now, there's nothing wrong with that as long as we understand that, it's our turn today and the other guy's tomorrow. Now, I've wanted to get this off my chest because I see all this anger and vituperation directed against the institutions of government, where in the United States of America, like no other nation in the world, we're it. But we can't even perform that very simple role of getting involved in the process itself. And I'm not going to let anybody off the hook on that count, because there is no substitute for the collective judgment of the American people. But if you think, as John Anderson pointed out, that 36% of the country represents collective judgment, forget it. You have government by minority, and in this case, probably minority one issues, in other words, developed across the spectrum of the offices that are up there. So if I had one plea to make out of all this, no matter what system we devise, nothing will work unless the American people actually participate. Now, what we can do is to devise the politics of the matter in a fashion where their participation can be more direct and more easily accomplished. I have no problem with that, but in the final analysis, even there, they're going to have to get out and vote.
Cokie Roberts?
Well, I'd just like to ask a question of the politicians here present, or the organizers. How do you plan to do it? I mean, when you say, John Anderson, that the American people will demand another candidate, that non-participation will force change in the electoral system, how?
Well, initially, Cokie, I think they're going to do it by fielding an independent candidate, perhaps more than one for president. I agree that is instantly going to raise the question of, well, how durable is any such movement? If it isn't deeply rooted in the political soil of the country, as I said, by electing members to state and local office, and particularly to congressional office, I'm not sure that it would be an enduring feature of American political life. But initially, I think, particularly after listening to Andy Kohut and the figures that he's given about the degree of dissatisfaction in the country today with both parties, it seems to me the idea that they could turn to a third candidate, an independent candidate, is not fanciful at all. Now, given some of the liabilities of functioning without a party, difficulty of getting on the ballot, financing the campaign, and so on, it's still a very problematic proposition that we're urging when we say, as I did, that I think we will see such a candidate, or perhaps more than one candidate, emerge in 1996. I don't want to be repetitious, but I think we are going to, if that succeeds, it will nevertheless be the focal point then for a long-term change in our political system that will see the flowering of a party and of candidates running for other offices at other levels. But yes, I feel that there is enough in the wind right now to indicate that the people could demand, not the formation necessarily of a party, but the advancement of an independent candidate to genuine consideration as a viable candidate for the presidency.
You know, if I can, to take up on this, and just to make the distinction, which I'm not so sure everybody has picked up here, John's right on target. There are two layers of prejudice to overcome election-wise. If you decide to run as a party, then you've got the whole business of setting up a party in 50 states. And believe me, that's a difficult task. It's difficult enough for an individual to get on the ballot. It's twice as difficult to set up a party and have the party on the ballot. And that's why you may very well have an individual. I mean, you know, I'm not running, but I know what goes on in the world. It's much more likely to have an individual run, and then the party comes behind. But that just, again, further demonstrates the difficulties that have been put in the path of any competition to either the Republicans or the Democrats. Cokie, I can tell you exactly how you do it. If I wanted to run, I'd run. Simple as that. I recognize exactly, as I stated initially, what the problems are. Their ballot access and their money. But, you know, maybe against what I lack, I speak personally, maybe I have the experience of having served in every office but the presidency. Maybe I have some pretty good ideas. Maybe it's time that we start to talk about ideas out there as to the policies of this country. So, you know, I understand that I have difficulties, but so do Republicans and Democrats. I mean, I think it's bizarre that instead of running the United States of America, we're out running for election in the year early 1995. Well, that's not the fault of the individuals that are doing it. The system has forced that upon them, so that's their disadvantage. So we all deal with disadvantages, but quite frankly, if you like the business and you love the country, just dive in, get into it.
Ron Evans, would you address the how question? Yeah.
The question that I see is how do we get the people involved, and I think John has made a very good example of it. One of the things that we've done in our effort is we've created a grassroots effort. If you notice what the other presidential candidates are doing, they're paying for a lot of airtime. We call it an air war. We've mounted what we call a ground war. We're going after the little people. Our contributions to date have been from $5 to $1,000. We've not even begun to look at the activity in terms of dealing with the matching funds and whatnot. But if we get everybody involved, as we intend to do with this grassroots effort, we're going to have a groundswell to the extent that there will be a lot of people involved in the political process to the extent that they've never been involved before. We're asking, if you may, the little people to get involved in this effort. And we're getting all kinds of support from around the country saying that we like the idea, we like the concept, and we're going to work with you. And we're having people coming out of the woodwork right now working with us on this effort. So it's away from the air movement. The $30–40 million is not something that we think we require for our effort.
But I wonder if you think that the ballot access issues that both Lowell Weicker and John Anderson addressed are significant impediments, or if basically you see this as a kind of a firestorm that would sweep the country, and these things that seem major impediments now are just going to be swept out of the way.
Well, we intend to use a strong petition effort, and I think that's how we're going to overcome the ballot access situation. Until the general declares, we're at a disadvantage, and we recognize that. Once the declaration has been made, we know that there will be pluses all across the board for him. Presently, he's running at 85% acceptance rate. We know also that the average is he'll probably lose 20%. It still leaves him at 65% approval rating. So we feel very strongly about our effort and why we're doing it.
And if I could ask specifically, when you say a petition campaign, do you mean people petitioning the general to run, or people signing petitions to put him on ballots?
Petitions to put him on ballots, and that's our effort at this time.
I'd like to turn to Cokie Roberts for a moment and ask her what she'll probably consider to be an unfair question, but I know she's heard it in many iterations before. And it's whether, basically, whether the press, almost the opposite of what she said, is really prepared to accept a third-party candidate as a viable candidate. The press is frequently criticized for narrowing down the field and winnowing it onto, quote, serious candidates. I know the Ross Perot people felt vehemently in October of 1992 that journalists wanted to report what was, and Perot wanted to talk about what might be or what should be. So that there's a contradiction, I think, in the tasks of the two entities here. And I wonder whether we'll find, as we get into 1996, whether there isn't sort of great enthusiasm for a third force candidate initially that will, by October, winnow down to the press saying basically only the two-party candidates really have a chance.
I mean, I don't want to get into an argument with Mr. Perot in absentia, but he was...
Well, get anyone with me then.
I mean, he was ready to talk about what he wanted to talk about and not what anybody else wanted to talk about, and that was a problem. I mean, there was one night when I had him on Nightline when I thought he was going to start throwing furniture, and it got a little testy. But it was a... he then called later and said, this is later than Nightline, I'd like to point out, and he said, I thought we were going to talk about the deficit. I had all my charts and everything, and I said it was the day he had qualified on 50 state ballots, by the way. I said, you know what we were going to talk about, and I didn't think you were very polite to me, and just to prove the point, he hung up. But I think that we do have the tendency to focus on candidates that we deem serious, but we deem them serious for a reason. I mean, we don't just sort of make it up. We deem them serious because they have a certain amount of money, they have a certain amount of support that is measurable, either in actual votes cast in various primaries or in polling before the primaries. I think at the moment we're clearly too quick to winnow right now. I mean, I hear a lot of my colleagues already writing off Phil Gramm when not one vote has been cast. So clearly we do that too quickly, and we want to know who the winners and losers are. And I do think that it becomes very difficult to make the decision about who is serious when you are looking at something like presidential debates. If you, as happened last time, include Ross Perot, why not Lenora Fulani? Then you get into that whole question. And so that it is much easier and tidier to deal with the two political parties. That's certainly true. But and it is true that even when you took someone as seriously as we took Ross Perot, which I think we did, his percentage of the vote was under 20. Now, it was significant, but it was not major, and it didn't throw the election to the House of Representatives or do anything dramatic.
Chris, if I can weigh in for just a minute on that question of whether or not the press will really accept as legitimate an independent candidate, I somewhat ruefully recall that in 1980 I was sufficiently credible as a candidate to have raised enough money to have my own press plane, but I was somewhat dismayed that the press then dubbed the plane Rosinante, the name of Don Quixote's horse, because it was considered somewhat Don Quixote-ish in 1980 to leave a major party, which I had done and run as an independent candidate. But we are so fixated, and Andy Kohut should be complimented, I suppose, at the fact that the American electorate is to that degree fixated on polls and the standings, the relative standings of candidates in the race, that the worst question that always confronted me at a daily press conference during the campaign was, well, Mr. Anderson, you've dropped another 5% in the polls. And the previous day, I could have made a speech advocating a 50-cent a gallon gas tax or a new foreign policy for the United States, and that was brushed aside because the main question was you're not doing too well in the polls. I can't blame the press, as Cokie Roberts has said, for demanding some degree of credibility in the candidates that they cover, and to the extent that there is an objective measurement of that credibility in the form of a poll, it's got to be considered. But I would hope that particularly if we're dealing with the angry voter that we started to talk about a few minutes ago, that we could get to the point where independent candidates would be judged on the vitality of their ideas, on whether or not they are really contributing something new and distinctive to the political dialogue.
I mean, do you want somebody in the press making the judgment his ideas are vital and his aren't? I don't think so.
Well, to the extent of reporting them, yes, I would. To the extent of at least acknowledging the fact that the suggestion has been made. He doesn't need to categorize them, I suppose, as vital and important. But I think they ought to be reported.
Andy Kohut?
I think that a lot has changed since 1980. I think that in 1992, the situation for Ross Perot was just the reverse. I mean, Ross Perot was getting more coverage in June of 1992 than Bill Clinton was, and he only lost his primacy in press coverage when he was the front runner and bailed out. And then when he came back, he obviously had a credibility problem. So I think that given, particularly in this coming election, given the prospect that the voters in the spring of 1996 will be unhappy with the candidates just about no matter who they are, at least that's the way it looks now, the idea that third-party candidates are not going to get an airing either in the polls or from the press, I don't think is consistent with what's going on these days.
Okay. John, Lowell, Ron, as you look at it, do you think that any of the established third parties out there, or minor parties, the Libertarians come to mind, the Progressives, the Patriots, the Socialists, and so forth, there are hundreds, in fact, of small parties, and I think I've named probably the largest of the small. Are those available to a national third-party candidate to come in and capitalize on this particular crystallization of politics, such that people are looking for a third alternative, or will something have to be built around those, something new like United We Stand?
Oh, if I may presume to answer, you mentioned my name, as they used to say in the House, and therefore I will undertake to reply.
Point of
I
personal
think
privilege?
that a credible effort is going to have to be built around the candidate. That point has already been made by others on the panel. And with all due respect to the existing parties that have been around for some time, I doubt very much whether they will provide the kind of support, the kind of infrastructure that would really carry forward a meaningful effort by a third or fourth candidate come 1996. So I think it is going to be an individual effort, much as I decry that, and much as I would like to see it based on support from lower levels of government. I just doubt very much that it's there. We've had 3 independent candidates for governor in recent years, Lowell Weicker, and one in Maine and one in Alaska.
Angus King in Maine.
Yeah. So it can be done. We can elect independents to statewide office. There isn't any question about it. But when it comes to the presidential race in 1996, it seems to me that it's going to depend on a very strong personality leading that effort.
Well, I couldn't agree more with John on this point. The fact is that you cannot look at either the Democratic and the Republican parties and say they really encompass everything that people are looking for in terms of leadership, which they don't, but that we're going to put under this party label or that party label. The American people are fed up with party labels. They've come to know that that's relatively meaningless. A while back in Connecticut, I tried to have the Connecticut Republican Party do away with the party platform. What is the purpose of a party platform right now? Nobody lives up to it. It says the most inane things, and everybody only gets more cynical as they view party platforms. Rather, the candidate should speak to the constituency, whether it's a city or whether it's a state or whether it's to the constituency. There is not sort of one size fits all. And I'll tell you, I heard, I don't know if this is so or not, because I really don't keep track of any of the other parties, about some summit meeting that's taking place, in Dallas with Mr. Perot. Well, God bless him, but I would no more go to a Perot summit meeting than I'm going to be invited to a Democratic or a Republican summit meeting, if I were right. The idea is to establish ideas out there which are attractive to the electorate, not adherence to a party. That's the whole problem with the system now. People feel that the politics come first and the governing comes second. Look, when I started out in this business, accountability, that's what was key in our whole election system. You took your stands and you knew you were going to live or die by those stands. The first major election I had was the congressional seat, 4th congressional seat from Connecticut, 1968. I was against the Vietnam War. My opponent was a pro-Johnson, pro-war Democrat. We both knew that issue was what was going to determine the election. And neither one of us fuzzed it up or tried to be all things to all people. Now, we've moved from that accountability to the politics of re-electability. Say any damn thing you want to, just get elected. And the problem is, then you do get elected, and then you're stuck with what you said in trying to gain the office. And the whole country is put on hold, even though the various parties can rejoice in their election day victory. And that's what you're coming against.
I agree with both the gentlemen at this point in time, but the thing that I see as a problem with going along with another party per se would be the baggage that you bring along with it. And I think that's a concern that any candidate, be it independent or otherwise, would have to understand. If you went with a party line, you have to bring along that entire platform or that entire slate of officers. And I think that's the greatest problem that you would have as far as being an independent candidate, what you bring with you. If you go by yourself, you bring your character, you bring your credibility, you bring your accountability, then you have that to live with. But if you have to bring additional baggage along with you, you've got a problem. And I just think in terms of a David Duke, for example, being on a party line.
I just would offer this bit of unsolicited advice to Ron Evans, however, that you inevitably, in your campaign, if Colin Powell is your candidate, are going to have to face the issue of can he govern? Given the gridlock that has been mentioned in the current Washington scene between Republicans and Democrats, you're going to have to overcome the skepticism not only of the press, but I think of the electorate at large, about the ability of the independent to transcend that gulf that exists between a Congress organized by Republicans and Democrats and this independent candidate who has no resources in the legislative branch other than his powers of persuasion. And I found that to be an issue that simply could not be gainsaid and wished away in the 80 campaign.
I agree with you there too, but to recognize, again, the general has not made a decision as he's running, first of all, nor is he running in a party. However, he has worked with both major parties very effectively, and I think that's a benefit to him at that point.
I'm going to go ahead.
I think there's a difference, again, between 80 and 96 on that as well, though. And I came to be convinced, and I'd like to hear Governor Weicker on this, as somebody who did govern, was, as you put it, not one member of your party in either house of the legislature. But I was very interested in that governing question as well, and I finally did come to be convinced that the signal that would be sent by having somebody of neither political party elected would be so strong that it would change the whole climate and culture here. And I think that some of what we're talking about here is a little bit skewed, because I think the 1994 election has already changed the climate and culture here to some degree. And I think the House Republicans would argue that they said what they were going to do when they got here, and that they have done it, that it hasn't been an unaccountable group. Now, you might not like what they've done, and you might say it will not get fully done by the Senate and signed into law and all of that, but they did run with a platform and come here and do it. So I think that some of the complaints have at least been partially answered. But I also do think that what that election showed was that the climate can change when a wind comes through, and that if you elected somebody as an independent, a very, very radical thing to do, that it would change the whole culture here and people would respond in a different way.
I'm not here to comment on the success or failure of either of the parties, but I will say this. I wasn't too surprised Republicans got elected. That's a hell of an appealing political document that was being displayed during the election. The problem, and fine, they've gone ahead and passed subsequently this appealing document. Now, what about the consequences? That's the problem. And that's what they're going to finally be judged on. But let me get to the point about governing as an independent. An independent plays the role of honest broker, whether during the election process or during the governing process. I repeat, not one single thing got passed by, quote, my party in the Connecticut State Legislature. And just so you understand, we weren't softballing it. I want to remind you, we passed the state income tax to eliminate the deficit and put the state in the black. We went ahead and enacted the toughest gun control measures in the country. We launched a significant program to eliminate the racial isolation of Connecticut in its educational system. There wasn't a hot political button that we didn't touch. But the advantage of being an independent in the executive is that you can be the lightning rod. You can let the blame fall on your head. And if you believe in anything, hey, put your beliefs out there. You don't care whether the blame falls on your head. And then you have to draw the numbers from both parties. In other words, you've got to get the visionaries and the people that are courageous and the people that understand the facts. And I got them from both the Republicans and the Democrats to put together the coalitions that faced up to these tough issues. But I have no doubt in my mind, had I been a governor of one of the major parties, the pressure would have been enormous not to saddle the party with any of these matters. Whereas when you're an independent executive, you can say, fine, let it just all fall on my head, but let's do the right thing in terms of the governing itself. And that's what happened in Connecticut. And I have no doubt that if somebody walks in as an independent into the White House, there'll be plenty of Democrats and Republicans that are going to do the right thing by this country. But the right thing is in the governing, not how it impacts on the political party.
I'm going to throw this open to questions from the floor in a minute. I'm going to ask one last question, which is a direct sort of takeoff of what we've been talking about here and takes it one step further. Frequently, one of the major complaints lodged against U.S. politicians that leads to that cynicism is that they are captives of special interests. Is there any evidence that independent or third-party candidates are any less captive of special interests? Or are they, in fact, more captive if they have to rely upon interest groups to get themselves elected? Anybody want to take that one on?
I think the problem there doesn't have so much to do with special interests as it does to the whole political process and the length of the process in this country. That's why special interests get in there. The amount of money required is enormous for anybody. And the time has come, I think, in terms of if you were going to do reform, to shorten all elections in the United States of America, which is a self-disciplinary action, which then cuts down the money and makes people less dependent upon special interests. But sure, an independent that's actually running out there is going to, be enticed just as anybody else is by what money's out there whatsoever, and then it depends on the candidate whether he wants to accept it or not. But money is one of the factors that truly is destroying the system. And I don't say that out of envy to the automatic $40 million that the Republicans and Democrats get, because I'll be glad to go out there and, campaign for my own money if I was campaigning. But I've got to tell you, this has gotten to be ridiculous. And you cannot avoid the First Amendment problems except that you do it in the way of cutting down the time of the election. In other words, you can't tell people what they can or cannot do in their expression of opinion. But I think you can clearly impact the total amount of money by shortening the elections. And by that I mean, in other words, the raising and dispensing of money.
I think an independent candidate would be in an unparalleled position, a splendid position to exert more independence from special interest money than either candidate from a major party, for the simple reason that by definition, special interest, particularly political action committees and the contributions that they control and direct, by definition, those contributions are meant to buy access. And they are going to make some very close calculations about who has access. And in every case, they're going to decide that's somebody who's already ensconced in power. That's an incumbent. An independent, I think, could break from that system. And if we continue to finance campaigns publicly for the presidential race, as I hope we will, I guess the House decided briefly that we wouldn't, and the Senate is going to decide otherwise. I think that there might yet be time to pass the kind of public financing law that would enable independent candidates to share not simply retroactively, as is currently the case, but prospectively in the disbursement of federal funds that are used to finance a presidential election. And I think it would be an important and significant advance to cleaner and better politics in this country if that occurred.
I think also that it's the choice of the candidate to take the money if it comes. He has the opportunity to dissect that organization and or corporation, whatever it may be, what their purposes and what their policies are, and make the determination within himself. If he's controlled by an organization such as a party, the party generally takes all the money they can get, and then they rely upon what their responsibility is to responding to that access. But I think that the independent candidate has the ability to, in fact, make the determination himself whether he wants to accept that money or not.
But at the presidential level, it is publicly financed. I mean, the $40 million that Governor Weicker keeps referring to is coming from taxpayer dollars, and it is so the whole idea is that special interests not be involved at the presidential level. The obviously
they still give soft money, though.
I understand. I was about to get to soft money, going to the political parties and all of that. But there's all of the answers on money have some problem connected to them. If it's somebody who is personally wealthy and spending his own money, that's got a problem connected to it. They've all got problems. I think that the bottom line is there should be less. No.
I agree, and I also want to correct history, because I notice it creeping into the press now, and they report on federal financing of presidential campaigns as being a Watergate reform. The Watergate Committee specifically voted down federal financing of presidential campaigns 4-3, because to the committee, Watergate was an abuse of the governmental process, and we didn't want to put that election and our elections, we didn't want to put that into the hands of the government. And sure enough, now we have it, and who's it there for except the two major parties? But I would appreciate it very much, having spent a considerable portion of my lifetime on that committee, if we didn't say that this was a Watergate reform. It was not.
Will you buy post-Watergate?
Huh? Post-Watergate, maybe. Post-Watergate, I'd buy Coke.
Okay, good. Sure.
But make no mistake about it, we were very wary of giving further power to the government in the election process. And as facts have evolved, we were right in being wary of that.
I throw the microphone open to questions, statements of outrage, other opinions, and so forth. Over here, and then here, and then here.
With all due respect to the panel, and I have enormous respect for the panel both individually and collectively, but I'm not buying it in some sense. I took a year off in 1980 to volunteer for John Anderson for president, National Unity Campaign for John Anderson for president. And what I carried away from that experience is, dagnabbit, this is hard. And I think it's hard to run an independent candidacy, not for the reasons that John Anderson and Lo Weicker stated, which is money and ballot access. The real problem is that it's a lot easier to disagree with both parties than it is to agree on some alternative. And I guess I direct my question to Andrew Kohut. I do sense that 1996 is different than 1980, different than previous years, but I guess I have trouble believing it's different enough. So that the natural tendency to read it at this moment in the cycle, even till much farther around in the cycle, that we want an alternative, doesn't go the natural way, which is then to have some alternative named and to find out that that person carries views that are not acceptable to the broad middle, and in other ways eventually suffers the fate that all independent candidates for president that we've ever witnessed suffer.
Well, you have to realize that in 1992, when Ross Perot withdrew in June, he was leading Bill Clinton and George Bush. And so we really don't know how his campaign would have played out had he not withdrawn. And the other thing is, remarkably enough, with all of his bizarre behavior, he still captured 20% of the vote, or nearly 20% of the vote, when it was all over. And I think the distinguishing characteristics of Perot and also of Colin Powell are strictly personal. Colin Powell is a hero, and that's why, and we have very few heroes, and that's why his appeal is so great in these surveys, these pre-election surveys that you see. Ross Perot's appeal was not an ideological appeal. I mean, he's a Texas billionaire businessman. That doesn't resonate particularly well with the public. But he seemed to be speaking common sense, and he seemed to be speaking unusually to people. And in an environment. And in that environment, and I would submit in this environment, those are very appealing characteristics.
Yes, sir.
Yes, hi, I'm Steve Michael. I'm with ACT UP here in Washington. And first off, I wish Governor Weicker had been picked by President Clinton to be the aid czar, and we had a cabinet-level aid czar with guts and courage and someone aggressive. We'd all have longer life expectancies in this country. In my work in ACT UP over the last several years, a group of us focused on the presidential campaign, the '92 election. When Ross Perot went to Washington State to have his turn in his petition signatures with his little deal. We quickly called a convention, formed a queer party, got signatures, and were on the same platform that Perot was. The state wouldn't bar access to the platform, and we wouldn't surrender that until we got some answers from Perot on AIDS and health care issues, because at that time nobody knew where he was on any issue. We got some answers after that, and they were all frightening, quite frankly. But one of the things I'm finding with independent runs, and Colin Powell's run in particular now, is that we keep talking about this person, but we don't know where they are on any issue of significance to the American people. Amongst African American youth in Washington, D.C., the #1 killer is AIDS, and yet I don't know where Colin Powell is on AIDS. There's not an African American in this country that knows where he is on the issue. How do we force these independent candidates who have high name recognition, who are high in the polls because they are nowhere on an issue, how do we force them to deal with issues early on so that we can make choices, and we can force the two major parties to deal with issues too? But if they're just going to be the same as Bill Clinton saying all things to all people, or Bob Dole switching from the right or left on Hollywood issues, I mean, how do we get them to deal with substantive issues?
Excuse me, did you say that people are high in the polls because they haven't taken stands on issues?
Well, I think when you look at, like, Ross Perot was high, we didn't know where he was on any specific issue. When I talked with him, he talked about tax users, people in iron lungs, and I mean, and he talked about bringing National Guard troops in the cities to immunize children, and then we'll keep them in the cities for other things. I mean, this man wanted to be president, and I had this information and the press didn't. And as time wore off, we all saw that he was crazier than his aunt in the basement. But, you know, what do we do about making them deal with substantive issues?
I think I can respond.
Now I'm glad Mr. Verney is not here.
Let me respond this way. I believe very strongly that General Powell, when he announces, will have positions on every issue that the American people have a desire or need to know about. And he'll speak very specifically about those. That's just my general feel. We can't speak for General Powell at this time. We are an exploratory draft effort. We believe in him as he stands. We've heard him. We've seen him. And what we've seen and heard has made us think that the American people are ready for him. I mean, it's gotten to the point where when he finishes an hour-and-a-half speech without a note the first, and you notice I rely on notes, he had people crying just on the issues that he dealt with. So therein lies a situation where a man has the capability of raising the consciousness of people to make them realize that there's a need for change. Beyond that, I can't speak for General Powell, but I can say that I believe that he'll have the necessary issues that will relate to the masses of this nation and make them realize that he stands for something.
John
Yes, please.
Well, just very briefly, Governor Weicker and I both have the honor currently of serving on a commission that was established by the 20th Century Fund, and we've held several meetings to date, and focusing specifically on the importance of debates in the presidential campaign. We haven't come up with a final report yet, and will not for some months. One of the ideas that certainly has appealed to me, and there's been legislation to this effect pending in the Congress, that we certainly should not make any grant of public funds in a presidential campaign until the candidate to receive those funds has definitely agreed and signed off on a fixed number of debates. Now, of course, that's the presidential campaign in the fall. That's the general election. How you do it in the primary process is a little bit harder and a different question, really. But certainly in the general election, the idea of having public financing of presidential campaigns without the advance assurance that the candidates will, in fact, participate in those debates where they can be cross-examined, where their views can be exposed to public view. That's the very least that we could and should do.
Could I, in passing the microphone over to Governor Weicker, second that by noting that currently what happens is, since the candidates have not been forced to agree, much of the confines of how the debate will take place is negotiated between the candidates. the kinds of questioning that will take place, the format, the height of the microphone, and so forth. It seems to me that candidates would lose a lot of leverage over that process if they were forced to agree that they would participate in debates, because in some ways the ultimate threat is that they can walk away from the table, which gives them much greater leverage in the bargaining. Lowell Weicker?
In response to the question, I think that also is the value of independent candidacies, of forcing the hand of the two major parties to give specific responses to the questions such as you've raised here. Now, as long as they can deal among themselves, they're not going to ask the tough questions, and they're not going to come forth with the tough answers. In my business, winning the office is sort of important. I think I understand that. I've been in 12 of these races and won 11 of them. In the case of an independent candidacy, there's a second purpose, which is to go out there and get a good debate going, which relies not on a lot of passing the baton back and forth and devising the softest landings possible, but giving simple, direct answers to very tough questions. And most of the time, those are going to be very tough answers, too. And if that's not what the American public wants, fine. That I abide by our democracy. But at least they ought to be raised, and an answer should be given, and that is what has been lacking in the process for too long. And there's where an independent candidacy, even if it doesn't win the office, can bring a lot, I think, to the American political scene.
I was going to say something totally heretical here, which is that people don't vote for president on the issues. There are people who vote on single issues, and those people tend to find out exactly where the voters stand, the candidates stand on those issues, whether it be AIDS funding or abortion or whatever, or guns. But by and large, at the presidential level, we vote on leadership qualities, and what we judge at those debates is not what people have said on the issues, but how they came across in the debate. Did he seem like a leader? Did he seem nervous? Did he, the famous Nixon-Kennedy debate where the people who heard it on the radio thought Nixon won, the people who saw it on TV thought Kennedy won. It is a different magnitude that we vote for when we vote for president. And yes, it's fine to get people to commit on the issues, but the number of people who vote on that at the level of president is very small.
Yes, sir.
I'd like to address this to Mr. Anderson and Mr. Weicker as the people who have been politicians. We've talked about ballot access and money. It seems to me that there's a third aspect. When Theodore Roosevelt was asked about the difficulty of sustaining the bull moose movement, which he actually tried to do, he said the problem was, quote, no loaves and fishes, by which he didn't explain it at great length at the time, but I took it to mean that people who joined him in his effort did not have the opportunity to reap various psychic and perhaps even financial rewards. And I would think that would still be a problem for a third, for an independent movement. And I wondered how you would, how a third party could deal with that.
Well, I'm not sure I understand your question. Before we proceed further, are you suggesting that the failure of an independent candidate to hold out the sure promise of some kind of reward in the form of patronage and otherwise is a factor that will deny him support from the voters? Is that your...
I'd like to know what you think, whether you think that's true or not.
Well, actually, if we have the angry American voter that everybody has been talking about today, and if that condition obtains when the election is held in 1996, I don't find it impossible to envision an electorate that could be sufficiently charged, sufficiently stirred up, that they would go out and volunteer. For example, in my campaign, there were 2 million signatures. That required literally thousands of volunteers who stood on windswept corners and in the rain in shopping malls and elsewhere to get people to sign a petition to get on the ballot. I think there is a great residue of spirit out there in the American electorate The real question is, how do you arouse it? I guess your question points to that in a way by suggesting there has to be some tangible promise that you simply don't end all of this by casting your vote, that there's going to be some realization of a certain dream. That depends, of course, on what the individual candidate offers by way of a program. If he calls for sacrifice, which candidates do not seem to be wont to do, that obviously might attract one kind of voter. If he promises a grand vision of a country that's going to be united as never before, that's going to stimulate another element in the voting population that is longing to see that particular wish fulfilled. So yours is a very difficult question for the simple reason that when you have an electorate of 150 million or more voters, people come at this from different angles. They have different motivations. But I think that the great bulwark of strength for an independent candidate would be what Governor Weicker and others on this panel have said today. It would come from a feeling that we need to really remake American politics, that fundamental change, which was talked about endlessly in 1992, simply isn't going to come about with a two-party system. You've got to broaden the range of choices in order to make that kind of change really possible. And that, I believe, would be a great and fundamental motivating factor in bringing forward an independent candidate in 1996, be it General Powell, Lowell Weicker, or someone else.
One of the niftiest aspects of having been governor of Connecticut was when I was elected, I did not have to run my choices through for the appointed positions in my administration through a town committee or the state central committee. And indeed, the talent pool available had doubled in the sense that we could pick either Democrats or Republicans or independents. So we had a huge talent pool out there of people that really, getting back to what government service used to be like, wanted to do something for their country. And that is still out there. It's made a little more difficult now that everybody knows they're going under a microscope and dragged around in the mud before they come into a position. Be that as it may, that's another problem. But there's no question in my mind that the types of persons that are looking for a remaking of the process, as John says, bringing about change, they're not looking for loaves and fishes. They really want to do something. And that is exactly what does happen in any sort of an independent regime, state, federal, local.
I have 5 people in the queue now, so there are lots of hands and our time is beginning to grow short. So if you would please make your questions directed towards 1 and possibly 2 at a maximum members of the panel. Please.
My question is directly for Cookie Roberts. What do you see the media's primary role being in covering elections and candidates? Is it, on the one hand, the horse race of who has more money, who's ahead in the polls, or is it the extraction of where candidates stand on issues and relaying that information to the public?
It's both, and there's constant criticism that we cover the horse race too much and not the issues enough. The truth is that every news organization has a series of reports at some point in the election cycle on, the 600-ship Navy. That was my personal favorite. But where the candidates stand on the environment, where the candidates stand on race, where the candidates stand on education, all of those things. Unfortunately, we tend to cover those early in the cycle when we have the news hole for it, and that's when voters aren't paying a great deal of attention to it. By the time voters are paying a great deal of attention, we are at the end of the election, and we are now into the horse race, because that's what's happening at that point. There are 2 candidates, or maybe 3 or 4 in this case, out and about and running against each other. So by the time that people start paying attention, we are often down to the who's going to win, who's going to lose part. But even at that part, I think that if you look at the coverage fairly, that you will find that there's a great deal of coverage not only of where people are on issues, but also of what the voters are saying and what the voters are thinking. And I think that then has the effect back onto the campaigns of what the voters are interested in.
Yes, right next to you.
My question is for Mr. Anderson and Governor Weicker. So oftentimes it seems that the independent candidates who have the most success are those who have already achieved name recognition through serving under the Democratic or Republican Party. And as the '94 Virginia Senate race indicated, oftentimes the candidacies of the independents are pegged as former Republican, former Democrat, and ultimately the outcome ends up strengthening the two parties as opposed to emerging as a third viable candidacy. The people who may initially get on board supporting another option, you know, days before the polls when it appears that the independent doesn't have a chance, end up going to one of the major parties. And I was just wondering if you have any ideas on how an independent can overcome that obstacle.
Well, I guess you're right to the extent that party pedigree is built on the basis of service to the party and primarily through service in public office. The last time that I can recall my former party, the Republican Party, nominating a genuine dark horse, I suppose, was in 1940 when Wendell Willkie was a candidate, and some people accuse I don't know whether Willkie himself, maybe his organization, of having packed the galleries to chant, "We want Willkie, we want Willkie," as being a great factor in his achieving the nomination. But for the most part, the leading candidates have been people that have served in public office under the banner of a party. Obviously, an independent is going to benefit if he has some kind of background of experience in office. Frankly, I think one of the disabilities of the Perot candidacy was the growing realization on the part of people that however brilliant he might be, and however well motivated he was, and I don't challenge him on either score, that nevertheless he had never really had to work in the nitty-gritty of politics to see what made the machinery go. So I think an independent candidate, whether he comes from a military background, as does Ron Evans' candidate to be, or from some other platform, has to convince the American people that he has the requisite experience to deal with the huge job of the presidency of the United States. So an independent is going to have to confront that, and the most successful independent candidate, I think, is going to be one who not only has ideas, but also has some experience to back up his claim that he is capable of leading the country.
Is that sufficient?
John's well
Fine.
answered the question.
Behind, in the second row there.
Yes. My name is Jesse Markowitz. I'm with the Libertarian Party of Maryland, and I know this is focused primarily on the presidential race, but as a representative of a party that expects in '96 to be running over 200 candidates for the House of Representatives, we've got over 150 office holders already around the country. In the state of Maryland, we've already got 2 office holders. My question gets back more to ballot access. One of the concerns that we have is that in order to run a full slate of candidates, not just the presidential race, but a full slate of candidates in Maryland, we're not talking about 5,000 signatures or 10,000 signatures. We're talking over 1 million signatures. You're looking at 100,000 hours plus worth of work to run a full slate of candidates. And I guess my question is for you, Andy Kohut. Do you feel that the public has the support to change the institutional laws that keep third-party and independent candidates off the ballot?
I don't think that the public is pining for a third party in a conceptual sense. I mean, they're looking for alternatives for specific races, and so I don't think that the support is such that says let's reform the system to make it easier for third-party candidates. What they're saying is, boy, I wish I had an alternative in this particular race or that race, and sometimes they're not looking for alternatives. They're happy with the choices.
Also, we've skipped around this subject of an independent candidate for executive position versus third parties, and we've sort of mixed it up and separated it and mixed it up again. I would argue that inside this institution, the institution of Congress, which is the one I know best, first of all, you could make a case that you have multiple parties already. You certainly don't have 2 firmly established, disciplined parties. The Republican Party in the House for this period of time has been, but that will start to fall apart soon, probably, and you traditionally do not have that. Secondly, I would respectfully disagree with Mr. Anderson on the question of proportional representation. It is hard enough in a country of this incredible size, as opposed to a much more homogeneous and smaller European nation, to get something done that balances the incredible interest of this country, which is not just, we always talk about the ethnic and religious differences, but the economic differences. And I'm not talking about rich and poor. I'm talking about states that produce oil and states that use oil, states that make cars and states that have dirty air. You know, the economic interests are very different. And it is essentially the role of Congress to bring that together, and it is very hard to do. And the minority voices are extremely well heard. You know, Senator Weicker would stand alone in the Senate on many a night stopping a constitutional amendment, and he was able to do that. Right now in the Senate, to get anything done, you need 60 votes. So there's not a problem, I think, in the Congress right now of not hearing enough voices and of not having the minority be able to get its voice heard. So I think that the third party is not something that people, as Andy said, are demanding. It is sort of the third candidate, and particularly at the presidential level.
I think also in response to your question, just to add on to what Koki's been saying, and I agree with what she's put out there, it's like everything else that's wrong in our laws that creates discrimination. You're going to have to blow it out one at a time through the court system. Now, I've done this in Connecticut. I tried, when I was in the Senate and was the titular head of the Republican Party, to allow independents to participate in Republican primaries. And the state, which was run by the Democrats, used all of its power to contest that. Well, that's a basic right of all of us, the right of free association. And we took it all the way to the Supreme Court, and just by a 5-4 vote, won. But we won. And so that went by the boards. So my answer to you that no, nobody's going to hand it to you. You're just going to have a series of legal victories to go ahead and make sure that the process operates as it was meant to operate.
Yes, sir.
Saying that you would not go to the United We Stand gathering in August if you were running. United We Stand is supposed to be a centrist group. You are talking about a centrist candidacy, possibly. Wouldn't that be a very important constituency for you if you were running?
The only blessing I need to run for president is my own. Simple as that. That's what an independent feels. And I don't need Mr. Perot's. I respect him. I'm not here to disagree with him, nor the leadership of the Democrat or the Republican Party. But if the decision is made, it'll be made for a variety of reasons, and I don't have to go to Dallas for those reasons. And I think that's the point that I was trying to make. I think we all know what it's about, which is that we sort of wheel and deal a little bit in Dallas to see if various people can bless various people, and they consider that they're one up politically. What I propose to you today for anybody that's running as an independent, anybody, Powell, Anderson, it doesn't make any difference. It's the strength of ideas that has to be put out there. I know what Koki said, and I'm well aware that perception of leadership is probably the most important factor in a presidential election. I don't dispute that. But I think maybe the people of this country are coming to the realization that we can no longer ignore issues, because then we get caught up in what doesn't happen or happens negatively after the election's over. So no, I'm not at all bothered by the fact of what I told you. Number one, I again repeat, I'm not running, but as you say, if I were, would I go? No, and that decision is one that I would make, and it wouldn't come in any conclave of the established political leadership, no matter from where. The other thing about United We Stand, I don't know what they stand for. I really don't. And I don't mean that as a negative comment. I'm really not clear at all as to what their positions on the issues are. So what am I supposed to do? Just because it guarantees me numbers in an election? Say, sure, I'd like your support. No, it's very important to me what anybody stands for before I link up with it.
Question way over here. That's you, sir.
Governor Weicker and Mr. Anderson, y'all served for a number of years in the House and the Senate as Republicans. I suspect Mr. Perot, though I don't know, might have been a Republican at one time before you left that fold and ran by yourself. First of all, what does that say for Republicans? And secondly, what relationship or what effect did that have on the relationship that you had previously with your colleagues and supporters in the Republican Party?
Well, my own personal experience as a Republican in the House of Representatives was that I frankly found even as long ago as the late 1970s that the party was moving away from me. I believe that on historic Republican positions with respect to the rights of women, support of the Equal Rights Amendment, which was a live issue then, support for increasing support for affirmative action and for civil rights programs, that the Republicans were retreating from what I at least believed as one Republican from the land of Lincoln were historic Republican positions. So it was a gradual estrangement, really, that then led to my declaration as an independent candidate in April of 1980.
My answer would be identical to John's. I mean, I think both of us were out there too many times on issues that we are very proud to be out on, and as Republicans. And finally, the door is closed, and the matters of interest no longer relate to real life in the United States. Rather, it becomes a philosophical agenda. And I don't think either John or myself are particularly good philosophers. There's much to be done in this country, and I wish maybe through the medium of this program that we all started to focus on what really needs to be done in this country. And when we start engaging in what people think about what goes on in Hollywood as being one of the attributes of a presidential candidate, or, you know, I can't believe it. This is the most powerful office in the world, and it can do so much. For God's sakes, let's everybody get focused around here and fast. So I think that's what we felt. I don't want to speak for John, but I know his record also, that whether it was civil rights or whether it was health or, you know, whether it was poverty, I don't care what it was. Yeah, we were sort of lone voices in the party, but at least we could go ahead and speak, and we had allies, and there still are some moderate Republicans in the party. There really are. But all this crazy business that's going on there right now, I just don't have time to spend on the unreal, that's all.
I think that you have the last question.
I was going to take Koki's comment one step further and say that I do indeed believe that the two-party system is working because of the '94 election. It doesn't seem like there's a lot of agreement on the panel. The differences in the parties, the ideology has become a lot more evident. There's no more gridlock that was based in the 103rd Congress. Something that everybody agrees that American public is against, which is big government, is becoming reduced, or there's a lot more talk about it. Mr. Evans, I thought you might be particularly interested in the Republican attempts at creating an opportunity society versus the old status quo. Maybe someone would comment why, indeed, do you believe a third party is necessary if you can't give a chance, at least to the new majority?
If I may.
Always nice to end on a fundamental challenge to the whole purpose.
You say opportunity society.
There's a lot of talk of that.
Is there a lot of talk about? We have a problem with full inclusion. There's too much divisiveness in both parties, but more particularly in the Republican Party. There are groups divisive to the extent that they have every individual kind of group that there is. Our movement is for full inclusion. We would like to be at the convention. We would like to be on the floor. We would like to talk about the things that concern us. It's not happening. You've got special interest groups within the party itself which are not a part of the total party. That's creating a bit of dissension for many of us, and I happen to be a Republican and very slowly moving away from that movement because of the lack of full inclusion. But it appears as though the ideological process is one of finding that independent thinking, independent feeling, independent direction, and realizing further that the minority is no longer the minority. They are, in fact, the majority.
I'd like to ask another sort of fundamental question here at the end, which is that one of the things that disturbs me is that I see people not just moving away from parties, but away from representative government. And Andy, I'm wondering if you have data. The last stuff I saw said 81% in favor of initiatives and referenda. And it seems to me that part of the result of all of this attack on government institutions, not just government institutions, American institutions as a whole, has had the effect of weakening our support for representative government and the whole idea that maybe we should all just, have direct democracy, and the idea of deliberation and leadership just goes out the window, not to mention compromise and putting together different interests. And I think that it's something that I'm seeing more and more when I talk to voters, and I'm wondering if you're seeing it more in your own data.
Well, I don't know if people have given up on representative government. I think they feel that their voices are choked off, that politicians aren't really hearing them, and therefore they like the opportunity to speak up directly. But given the fact that the participation rates in the '94 election were so low, or at least so average, and weren't any greater than they had been in the past. In 1992, we did have higher turnout. You have to challenge that assumption as well. If there was such a great desire for people to speak out, why didn't turnout go up in '94? Turnout was flat and in relative terms lower than '92.
John Henderson?
On that last point, one very interesting statistic that I have in front of me that about voter turnout. Only 17 of the 56 Republicans who won seats in 1994 that had formerly been held by Democrats, only 17, that would be less than 1/3, had higher vote totals than losing Republicans had in contesting those Democratic seats 2 years earlier in 1992. It goes to your point, Andy, that for all of the talk about this great change, people weren't taking it. They weren't participating in what was supposed to be this landmark change election.
The levels weren't higher, but the character of the people who turned out was remarkably different than in other elections.
No, but it does strike me that, and Ms. Roberts is right, that to some extent the search for a third-party candidate is bypassing the kind of existing political system that we've built here in this country, and put together with the rise of petition campaigns, and you get politicians. Some of the things that Ross Perot said were, we'll have a representative poll, and then that town meeting will show the Congress exactly how to vote, and will sort of put them in Washington under a vice of more populist, plebiscitarian kinds of politics. So I think it is perhaps a question for another panel, and we'll have you back here in a couple of months, Koki. But if there are no more concluding comments, I'd like to thank the panelists for giving us 2 hours of their precious time. On behalf of the students and the faculty, I'd like to thank all of those in the audience for their persistence and their interest. Thank you all very much. So I will call. It was fun.